Hello, friends, and welcome to the next episode of the 40 Days and Nights podcast. I'm Mariah,
Hi, everyone, and I'm Sarah.
and we're so glad that you're back for part 3 of our deconstruction conversation.
You're like, what? You have more to talk about this?
So much more.
Yeah, we started the first kind of pilot episode by saying that this, you know, was born out of our deconstruction. So it makes sense that we have a lot to talk about. So
hmm
buckle up.
hmm And it's a journey, so there'll always be more to talk about.
Exactly.
hmm
Yeah, like 10 episodes from now, we're going to be talking about it still. So,
Probably. uh, Well, last week we talked a little bit about more like evangelical culture and what that has looked like, especially right now, um, in the era of Trump, basically, and the time leading up to the election. So I think this week we're going to look a little bit more about theology.
yeah, we've been talking about um, things that affect more people, like more broadly. And now we're going to talk about our kind of personal theological shifts and changes in deconstruction and reconstruction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Where do you want to start? I feel like there's so many places to start.
Yeah. Um, I don't know. I think maybe just for you, Mariah, like thinking about all of the theological things that you know or understand or believe,
Mm-hmm.
what is like the biggest one that has changed since, um, I guess, from the beginning of college when things kind of like shifted for you in your faith journey to now?
Mm-hmm. I think that my idea of like what mission looks like and
Mm.
what evangelism is something that has changed drastically. Um, and viewing it as important, but in like a very different way. So like when I was in college, and part of this evangelical ministry, I was like pretty much convinced I was going to be a missionary. Um, Either like abroad or in the United States, and really looked at like being in the 1040 window, which in evangelical terms is this like block of the world with the most unreached people groups. Um, and so I like really felt um, like if what I believed was true and like all of these people were dying and going to hell because they'd never heard of who Jesus was before, and their eternity was dependent on us going to tell them, like, why wouldn't we go do that, right? um and then I just kind of got fed up with the hypocrisy of it, of like, if we really believe this, if we really believe that is dependent on us, then why are we sitting at conferences? Why are we on like at college? Like why? And it was like this framework of like everyone has like a different vocation, not everyone's called to that. But if we're
Mm.
talking about people's eternities, like why does it matter? Like if we're supposed to have this view in light of eternity, then why are we content with like having lives in the States and a few people going? Um, so I just kind of got to a point where it was like, it seems like most people don't actually believe it.
Mm.
Like if we're gonna talk about like actually living it out, let's actually live it out. So it just kind of started to feel like faulty. Um, and also kind of realizing how colonial that is, of like having all of the white people from the US go over and like try to convert all of these people. Like it was just, I started to realize like how harmful that can be. So my idea of mission and what that looks like changed a lot. Um, and starting to feel more and more uncomfortable with like cold evangelism and trying to convince people and apologetics. And so that has kind of shifted as well of like what do I feel like is a way to talk about faith with people in a way that's like healthy, and is like caring for the other person, and the end goal is just having a conversation and not something else. So I think that's probably the biggest thing for me.
Yeah, and I think that's a really big thing. Um, like when you were talking about like going to convert people in that 1040 window, my dad shared a letter from his uncle, my great uncle, from like the 50s when he was a missionary in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole premise of it is like converting the heathens. Like that's what like he talks about in this. And I think, you know, obviously I think there's a little more nuance today, but I mean, it's still colonialism. Like when I went to Tanzania, the church that we worshiped in was I forgot we were in Tanzania for a second because it looked like we were in like Kansas,
Mm-hmm.
because it was like this little white church building that is like American, because that's
Mm-hmm.
who came and built it. Um, so yeah, I can definitely understand. And I think mission, particularly, at least like in the ELCA, um, I don't know if you were asked this question in endorsement, but um, I had to talk about like what like God's mission on earth
Mm-hmm.
is. And I think so it's an important thing for us. And I think that, you know, I had to kind of deconstruct that too, of like what like vocation and stuff. Like, sure, we're all doing God's work regardless of what we're doing, but there's definitely a hierarchy
Mm-hmm.
in the evangelical world. Like being a missionary or a pastor is like number one. Like everything else is like not as good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Is there like something similar or different for you that was kind of like the biggest or like the pinnacle of like theology that you worked through?
Yeah, I think this is a little more broad, but um, just kind of the sin of certainty
Mm-hmm.
that I experienced. I was actually looking, I was like clearing out my phone because I had a bunch of pictures, and I had a screenshot of a conversation that I had had with one of the leaders of the ministry that we were involved in college, talking about a situation that had happened at one of the weekly meetings in which um, there was a presenter who said that he said to all the biology majors that your professors are wrong about evolution. Um, and I had a conversation with the leader about this, saying like, hey, like, what is going on with this? Like, if like we can't just say this and not have the other side of it, because now you're at a point where you're like influencing people in like a
Mm-hmm.
negative way, like you're saying that this is the
Right.
only way possible. um Backstory, my dad is a biology teacher, so I grew up in a household where I knew evolution was the theory, and that I also believed in God. um
You can do
that's
both? What?
apparently not. And that's never been something that I've ever questioned. Like even like while I was in that ministry, like um, I thought more about like oh, that there's like scientific ways that you can prove like God's existence or whatever. Um, I don't think that's the point. Like that to me just like makes it seem so shallow,
Mm-hmm.
and there's not like a robustness to it, because the whole point is like you're having faith in something that doesn't make any sense at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like the mystery of God is something that I like need, rather than being like, this is the right answer, this is the only way. This is the only right way. So yeah, I think that has been like the biggest thing for me, is just not only when I brought up some uncomfortability that I don't need to know everything.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Like I'm okay with it. Like I'm okay. I don't know. It doesn't affect my life enough that like I feel like I need to know everything about God, or have this crazy idea that I can actually know everything about God.
Right.
Like God reveals God's self in many different ways, and I will never have the full picture.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think it like diminishes our understanding of God, is like beyond our understanding if we go out of our way to try and explain everything. um, if we try to explain, like, try to say, like, this is the justification and proof for why everything in Genesis literally happened and the way that it's literally written, like, what, like, why can't we just say, like, God worked in the way that God worked and we're here now and that's like okay. um I don't know. I think there's a difference between like looking for answers in a way that's like beneficial and trying to look for answers to be certain in a way that's just like almost idolizing it, like idolizing being able to say that you're certain about everything about God.
Yeah. I think, I mean, when you talked about like mission work too, and you said like in evangelism, the word you used was convince people.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's your framework that you're operating from, of like, I have to convince people to believe what I believe,
Mm-hmm.
then you're already like starting from a difficult spot,
Right.
because that isn't the point.
Right.
Convincing also just sounds so like coercive and like manipulative.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what I think when I hear that word, of like almost like tricking people into it.
Right. And like I I feel like if we talk about like sharing the good news, and this is like good news for all people, if we're sharing it in a way that we have to convince people that it's good news, then we're not doing the gospel justice. Like if we have to try and convince people like that this is a good thing, if we have to convince people that it's something that they should want, like then we're not preaching about it the right way, in my opinion.
Yeah. I think humans get in the way of the good news all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're supposed to be the way that God reveals God's self to people on earth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pastors and other people who are involved, deacons, lay leaders, they're all supposed to reveal God's self when they're preaching.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're in the way, like you said, like if we're um, not doing it in a way that like shows people that this is good news, then it's not good news.
Right. Is there anything that you
No,
would
you're
say
fine.
that you're kind of still working through, or like
Yeah.
deconstructing?
Um, the Lutheran understanding is not universalism. Um, that is like the whole like predestination, free will sort of thing gets like really messy with all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think because, like you said earlier, like we were kind of taught that if these people don't know Jesus in their earthly lives, then they're like going to hell. I'm obviously not in that camp anymore, but I'm trying to figure out like, okay, so the Lutheran theological understanding is not that everyone just goes to heaven. Like that isn't what it is. So I'm like trying to figure out like what it is that I believe. And that's been kind of interesting. Like I've had conversations with people. Like I don't think it's wrong to be a universalist. I think that is the one thing that I have the most questions about, though, of like the end, I guess, like the afterlife-y kind of thing. Like that's where I'm like the most confused, I think, and still working through stuff.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that because I remember feeling very confused and going through the Book of Concord and seeing all of the things that the people who wrote the Book of Concord had to say about people like not believing in Jesus and going to hell. And I'm just like, wait a minute, I've never heard an ELCA pastor preach about this ever. So like, where's the disconnect between what we're supposed to believe in, like what we're preaching? And if we actually believe that this is a thing, why don't we talk about it? And if it's not a thing that we actually believe, why don't we talk about it? So like there was a huge disconnect for me of like, it was almost kind of, I almost low-key felt like I was like back in like evangelical world of like not knowing what the actual doctrine is until you're in leadership, which is like super problematic. Of like, I had no idea this was a thing until I was actually like, until I actually had to go through the whole thing and like work through the book and this thing that's supposed to be our doctrine that we're supposed to subscribe to. And I was so confused. I felt like I low-key got Jesus juked, like and I don't know, I just like still feel kind of upset about that. Honestly, like it was just really, I still feel confused about it.
Yeah, that whole book, the one of Melanchthon's main concepts was the idea of consoling consciences. Like that's one of the main things that I took away from reading that. And for Lutheran theology and doctrine to also then say in the same sentence, like, and these people are going to go to hell. Like that to me, like, doesn't add up. That doesn't compute.
Right.
Like, especially when thinking like, okay, so does that mean everybody before Jesus was just automatically going to hell? And then everybody now, like post Jesus, like if they hadn't heard or had the opportunity to hear about Jesus, they're just going to hell? Like that's what we're saying?
Right.
Like that doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think along with that, something that I like really struggled to wrap my head around is the idea that like in a beyond American context, like there are people who live their whole life literally in hell on earth. And so you're telling me that people who've literally lived in hell on earth their entire life because they were born in a country that they didn't choose and born in an area of the country where Christianity isn't the most popular religion, because of those things and nothing to do with them, they're just gonna die and be separated from God forever. Like I still struggle with that of like, it seems like so American and Western to like not consider the fact that people are literally living in hell right now because of human brokenness and people having to deal with really horrible, awful, evil circumstances.
Yeah. And even those American Christians are they're like, we are going through a time here in the United States right now.
Mm-hmm.
There's no denying that.
Right.
And because of that, though, people, particularly white evangelical American Christians, are claiming persecution, that they are being persecuted at this time. And the whole idea of like, oh, because we are suffering, like that means like we're doing the right thing. Like, you know, we're like Paul. Paul was suffering, and, you know, God loved Paul very much and all that stuff. But there's also a difference in the fact that, like, Paul knew that suffering was inevitable, but I really think that white evangelical American Christians are causing their suffering themselves.
Oh yeah,
Like,
absolutely. Yeah, it feels like there's a huge difference between like suffering as an inevitable consequence. This is something we talked about in New Testament like a few weeks ago, of like suffering as an inevitable consequence of following Jesus versus seeing suffering as something that we're supposed to seek out. Like, we're not doing the Christian thing right if we're not seeking out suffering. And so I think that's led to this whole like war on Christmas. They're trying to take Christianity away. They're trying to make it illegal to be Christian. And it's like, no, that's not at all what's happening. It's just coming up with any excuse to make it seem like you're suffering for your faith when you're not.
yep. Like, the reasons you are suffering are because of what you're doing to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you, like, fabricating these things, like, that does cause, and like, that does cause suffering. Like, they are suffering. I'm not denying that. But what they're suffering for is not for the gospel.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, it's for pride. Isn't there like a
Yeah.
thing in the Bible about like prayer and fasting and doing it in a way that other people can't tell, so you're not boasting about the fact that you're doing those things? I feel like that's in the Bible somewhere,
No,
maybe.
you're mistaken.
Oh no, who
Well,
cares what Jesus said?
no, I sure don't.
Oh no. We need to be careful and hope that no one like edits out pieces to make it seem like we're saying things we're not. It's like, look at these heretics. Look at what they're saying.
Yeah, this would be a good episode for them to put on, exposing the ELCA.
Right. Yikes.
We live rent-free in their minds.
So great.
I think, not to like generalize like what both of you and I are talking about, but I think the crux of our deconstruction like hinges on the American Christian like superiority complex.
Mm-hmm.
Like, everything that we're saying is because we, like, white Christians in America, are the new saviors. Like, we have to fix everything.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we have to know everything. We have to do everything.
Right. Yeah, there's a huge savior complex in this whole idea of like, we have to take God into these places, and it's like, God's already there. It has nothing to do with you. Like, are we being invited into work all over the world to like work alongside God and the work that God's doing? Absolutely. But God's presence in a place has nothing to do with a Christian's presence there. And so like how arrogant are American Christians to think that a city doesn't have God until someone comes in and plants a white church from the suburb into a city. Like God was already there. Like it's not dependent on this church coming in and planting a church for God to magically appear. Like
yeah. There's two things. Like one is we've taken God and put God in this vessel of like here God is. Can't you see God? I have God, and now I have to give you God. No. Second, when you were saying that, I was thinking of the story of Jonah. And in that story, like Jonah kind of does bring God to Nineveh. And so I think there are stories, unfortunately, in the Bible that are telling Christians in America things like that, if you interpret it that way.
Right. Interpretation is key. Speaking of which, friends, there's no objective way to read the Bible. Just gonna say that now. Objectivity in Scripture does not exist. Just saying that right now. Just putting that on the table.
Yep. Every translation is an interpretation.
Yep. And we all bring our own subjective experience to the text. It's just how it is. And we should be, that's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing to bring your personal experience with you when you read the Bible. It becomes problematic when you think that your personal experience is objective.
That's the quote.
That's going on Instagram, folks.
That's the thing, though. I think you touch on, like, it isn't that people's personal experience is wrong or that their personal understanding or interpretation is wrong. You're saying it is wrong to ascribe that to every other person.
Yes.
Like, it is foolish. It is foolish to think that my white, cisgender, married to a man womanness in America, like I would never try to ascribe what I believe and how I interpret scripture onto somebody. For example, my family friend that lives in Taiwan, like our experiences are very dissimilar. Like she's gonna interpret it differently,
right?
And that's not a bad thing.
Yeah. There are like so many different lenses to read the Bible that speak to the experience of different groups of people, and all of those are valid. Like people's experiences are valid, and it's completely valid and okay to read the scriptures through your lens and experience. But yeah, I totally agree. Like what you said, of it's totally and completely not okay to say that your experience is the only objective one and therefore everyone has to read the Bible through your lens of experience because it's the only right one.
People have to own and like live into their own personal experience for them to like be okay with what they're reading and have it be different than what they've been told they have to interpret it as.
Yeah.
Because I think we live in a world where people are told it is wrong for you to think that way, even though that is your experience.
Right. Or like I remember like a few years ago, like when I would read that Bible, I would think like, oh, I have to figure out what the actual objective meaning of this text is. And like now I'm in a preaching class and we're in groups of like 4 people, and 4 people will preach a sermon on the same passage, and like both times we've done it so far, every single person has preached a different sermon with a different idea, and it's totally fine. Like, why can't we just be okay with the fact that the Spirit's moving through our own personal experiences and giving us the word that we need to preach for our context, for where we are, and for where other people are, and that's not going to look the same every single time, and like that's completely okay. Like, let the Spirit do what's the Spirit's gonna do.
Yeah. I mean, we want to control her too, so.
Right. Something that I've been talking about with some people as well, like it's come up in class and in other conversations, is this idea that all of the revelation about God is in Genesis through Revelation, and in the several thousand years that have passed since then, God has not revealed anything about God's self. Like, what? You're telling me in like 2,000 years, like God has not revealed anything else about God's self to people through experience or through other writings that have become very sacred for different communities? Like, what?
Yeah. I'm glad you bring that up because for one of my New Testament classes that I'm taking this semester, we had to read an extra canonical book called The Acts of Paul and Thecla.
Mm-hmm.
And I highly recommend people read it because it is a strong female, independent, I'm not going to follow the rules of society type of person. And I wrote in like one of my responses to it saying like, imagine how different the world would be had this book actually been put in the canon. Like the representation of that person is so, I was like floored. I was like, if this were in my Bible, like it'd be so great.
Right. Like, to have, like, imagine having like that model of someone pushing back against all of the societal expectations of her and say, nah, I'm good, fam. I'm gonna do I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna follow God and what I think it looks like for me, and for me that looks like not getting married or having kids. Right. And like that's okay. And like how much different would things look if that was there?
Well, that's why they kept it out.
I mean,
like, even thinking about like some of the Gospels, like, like painting Rome in a like society as to not be troublemakers. Like, there was a purpose, and it's yeah, I don't know, I'm on a soapbox, but like why would they put that story in there? It would ruin everything that they had tried to build.
Man. Yeah, I think this is where the American Christians have done a huge disservice to people in not being willing to teach people, like people in congregations, this stuff. Like it's like very perspective and worldview shifting things to learn how the books of the Bible were chosen and put together into what we now know as the Bible, and who wrote them and different authorship for those different books. Like it completely changes your perspective and doesn't make it any less sacred, but does change how you see things. And for people to continue to not know about it, I think is a huge disservice to people in congregations. That it's this some sort of like secret knowledge that only a very few amount of people have access to. I don't know. I'm like a very firm believer that a lot of the basic things we learn in seminary should be common knowledge for most of the people, if not all of the people in churches. Because like it's very like crucial to faith formation and understanding. Um, so make those things accessible to as many people as possible.
We talked a lot today about theology and deconstruction, and who knows what we're going to talk about next time. We sure
Right.
don't yet.
Yeah. Um, who knows? This could turn into a 10-part series, although people might stop listening if that happens. So if you have suggestions on what you would like to hear about, let us know. But thanks for listening. We appreciate it. Yeah, we hope that the things that we have to say might be helpful for just one person, maybe. So thanks for listening.
Yep, we'll see you next time.
Bye, friends.
Bye.